Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen,
And I'm Paul Carter.
and we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep on B.H. Roberts.
Yeah. This is going to be a fascinating one. We're talking about a guy who was really in the thick of it, like right at the heart of Mormon leadership and scholarship in the early 1900s. And his story, well, it's about more than just intellectual history. It's about, what happens when a really, really devoted believer starts to ask really, really tough questions about his faith.
Yeah, and B.H. Roberts, he wasn't just some fringe figure, right? This guy, he was born back in 1857, and he wore a lot of hats. I mean, he was a Utah politician, a super well-respected LDS church historian, and he ended up as a general authority serving in the presidency of the 70s.
Oh, yeah, and that position back then, the presidency of the 70s, it wasn't just any old leadership role. Like, people considered it pretty much on par with being an apostle.
Exactly. And get this guy, he was rubbing shoulders, working directly with some of the biggest names of the time, James Talmage, Anthony Ivins, Francis M. Lyman. These were the heavy hitters, the intellectual and spiritual giants of that era in Mormonism.
Right? Like, these were the guys shaping the church's direction, and B.H. Roberts was right there with them.
Totally. And to give you a sense of just how much they valued B.H. Roberts, Heber J. Grant, who was church president back then, he called Roberts their top apologist, their greatest defender, and one of their best scholars. I mean, that's a pretty ringing endorsement, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It tells you just how much they trusted his intellect and his ability to, defend the faith.
For sure. And you see that right from the get-go in his career.
Yeah.
He really focused on defending the core tenets of the church and the Book of Mormon that was right at the center of it all. I mean, he churned out a ton of writing, all aimed at supporting the Book of Mormon's credibility as a real historical record.
Right. He was their go-to guy for making the case for the Book of Mormon, especially as, more and more questions were starting to pop up.
And he was prolific. I mean, in 1895, he published his New Witness for God, which was this big early defense of the faith. Then you've got his massive 7-volume History of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which he worked on for over 30 years, from 1902 to 1932. I mean, that's a pretty foundational historical work, right?
Oh, absolutely. Huge undertaking. And it really solidified his reputation as, the leading historian and defender of the church.
Then on top of that, he comes out with New Witnesses for God, volumes 2 and 3 in 1909. And these were specifically focused on the Book of Mormon, trying to present the strongest possible evidence for its authenticity.
Yeah, and that was all before his 2-volume Defense of the Faith and the Saints, which came out between 1907 and 1912. So you can see, I mean, this guy was a machine. He was totally dedicated to upholding the historical claims of Mormonism, especially when it came to the Book of Mormon.
Totally. And here's where things get interesting. If you only look at his early writings, you only get part of the story. You can see over time, B.H. Roberts, he starts to change. He starts to have doubts.
Yeah, I mean, this is the early 20th century. There are all these new discoveries happening, new ways of thinking are coming out, and, people are starting to challenge all sorts of long-held assumptions, not just in religion, but in science, history, everything.
Totally. And for the Book of Mormon, one of the big challenges was this new field of archaeology. People started asking, okay, if the Book of Mormon is this historical record of ancient civilizations in the Americas, where's the physical proof? Where are the ruins, the artifacts, the evidence?
Right. I mean, up until then, a lot of the arguments for the Book of Mormon's authenticity were based on linguistic similarities or interpretations of, Native American traditions. But archaeology, that was a different beast. That was all about hard evidence, about digging things up and finding physical proof.
Absolutely. And at first, B.H. Roberts, with his, scholarly training, he tries to tackle these new questions head on. He even uses some of his earlier apologetic work, like parts of New Witnesses for God, to engage with the archaeological stuff, trying to find connections and explanations. But the deeper he digs, the more he starts to realize that some of his earlier arguments, well, they were kind of shaky.
Yeah. I mean, it takes a lot of intellectual honesty to admit that, right? To say, hey, some of the things I used to argue, maybe they weren't so solid after all.
And he really does admit it. In George D. Smith's 1996 article in Dialogue, he quotes Roberts as saying that his earlier attempts to deal with some of the Book of Mormon problems had not been altogether as convincing as I would have liked to have had them. And then Roberts goes on to say that as he kept researching, he found the difficulties more serious than I had thought. So it wasn't just a minor tweak, right? This was a big deal, a real reassessment of the evidence, and it was driven by his own scholarship.
Wow, that's huge. I mean, this is a guy who had built his career on defending the Book of Mormon, and now he's saying, wait a minute, there's some real problems here.
Exactly, and it eats at him. He's got all these unresolved questions. He's got this growing sense of unease, and he knows he can't just keep it to himself. So starting in late 1921, he starts putting it all down on paper. He starts writing these manuscripts, and these aren't for like public consumption. These are specifically for the top church leaders.
Wow, so he's taking his concerns straight to the top. He's not messing around.
Not at all. And this leads to, honestly, one of the most pivotal moments in this whole story, the meetings of 1922. Roberts, he's troubled by what he's found. So he writes to the First Presidency. He basically says, look, I need to sit down with you guys. I need to talk about my research. And what happens next is pretty extraordinary.
Okay, so what happened? Give me the details.
So in January 1922, they set up these meetings in Salt Lake City. And it's not just the First Presidency, which at the time was Heber J. Grant, Charles W. Penrose, and Anthony W. Ivins. No, they bring in all 12 apostles and the entire quorum of the 70.
Whoa, so we're talking every single general authority in the entire world at that time?
Every single one. Like, imagine the weight of that, right? This wasn't some small gathering. This was the entire leadership of the church, all assembled to hear what B.H. Roberts had to say.
Yeah, and they didn't just meet for like an afternoon. These were serious multi-day meetings.
3 full days, to be exact. For the first 2 days, it's Robert's show. He's laying out all his research, focusing on what were called external and scientific issues related to the Book of Mormon. So think about it. The archaeology, the lack of evidence, the potential contradictions with what science was saying about ancient America, linguistic stuff, all the things that cast doubt on the Book of Mormon as a literal historical record.
So he's basically presenting the church leadership with all the toughest questions, all the stuff that doesn't quite add up.
Exactly. And then, on that third day, they shift to discussion. There's some indication that Anthony Ivins, who, he had some experience with these debates about Book of Mormon geography, he might have tried to offer some counter-arguments or maybe a different way of looking at things. But I mean, can you imagine being in that room?
Oh man, the tension must have been so thick.
Absolutely. And we actually have a little glimpse into these meetings from James Talmage's journal. He was another apostle, another respected scholar, and he writes that Roberts presented this lengthy but valuable report on his Book of Mormon studies. And here's the kicker. Roberts actually had a list, and he titled it Difficulties. These were all the discrepancies he'd found between the Book of Mormon and what, scientific investigation was showing.
So he wasn't just saying, hey, I have some doubts. He was bringing receipts. He had specific problems, specific inconsistencies.
Exactly. And that's what makes what happened next so, so disappointing, I guess. The way it's been described, instead of really diving into Roberts' research, engaging with the specific problems he'd raised, instead of like a real back and forth intellectual discussion, a lot of the general authorities, their response was basically to bear their testimonies.
Oh, wow. So like, I know the Book of Mormon is true because I feel it in my heart.
Yeah, pretty much. Like, there's this account of George Albert Smith, who was an apostle at the time, and he starts crying as he bears his testimony about the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon. And while President Ivins, he might have tried to offer some thoughts, apparently he couldn't really provide the kind of comprehensive answers Roberts was looking for.
Man, I mean, I can only imagine how frustrating that must have been for Roberts. Here he is, he's spent years on this meticulous research, he's brought specific problems to the table, and the response is basically, well, we just know it's true.
It really seems like there was a disconnect, right? Like, Roberts the scholar, he's looking for intellectual engagement, he wants to wrestle with these issues, and he's met with, essentially, faith-based affirmations.
Yeah.
And it doesn't sit well with him. In fact, after the meetings, he actually writes a letter to Heber J. Grant, and he expresses his frustration, his disappointment, that the leadership didn't really grapple with the issues he'd raised in the way he'd hoped.
So what does he do? I mean, does he just give up at that point?
No, he doesn't give up at all. He doubles down. After the 1922 meetings, he keeps going with his research, but now he shifts his focus a bit. Now he starts looking at what he calls internal problems and literary aspects of the Book of Mormon itself.
Interesting. So now he's not just looking at the external stuff, the archaeology and all that. He's turning his attention to the text itself.
Exactly. And the question he starts to ask, it's a big one. He starts to wonder, was Joseph Smith really the translator of the Book of Mormon, or was he actually the author? I mean, that's a huge question, right? It
Yes,
gets
right.
right to the heart of what the Book of Mormon claims to be.
That's the million-dollar question, right? If Joseph Smith wrote it, then it's not a translation of an ancient record. It changes everything.
Exactly. And part of what gets Roberts thinking this way is that he starts to see some pretty striking parallels between the Book of Mormon and this other book, View of the Hebrews, which was written by Ethan Smith back in 1823.
Hold on. So is he saying that Joseph Smith just plagiarized View of the Hebrews?
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. It's not like he's saying Joseph Smith just copied it word for word. But Roberts, he starts to theorize that View of the Hebrews, which, was this book that explored the idea of ancient Hebrews coming to America, it might have served as like a ground plan for the Book of Mormon. Like maybe it provided some of the themes, the concepts, the basic framework that Joseph Smith then built on.
Okay, so it's more like maybe View of the Hebrews gave Joseph Smith some inspiration, some ideas to work with.
Exactly. And it's not just that. Roberts also starts to look at other things in the Book of Mormon. He questions the sheer number of miracles, saying it feels overly miraculous. He also points out that the characters sometimes seem a bit flat, like they don't have the kind of depth and complexity you'd expect from real historical figures.
Interesting. So he's applying a more critical eye to the text itself, looking at its literary qualities, its storytelling.
Yeah, he's not just taking it at face value anymore. He's really digging in.
Mhm.
And remember, he's writing all this down in these private manuscripts. And in his second manuscript, which is quoted in the Mormon Stories transcript, he actually writes out his conclusion, and it's pretty heartbreaking. He says, "One mind is the author of them, and that a young and undeveloped but piously inclined mind, the evidence I sorrowfully submit points, some will contend to Joseph Smith as their creator." And that word sorrowfully, it really gets to you.
Yeah, I mean, you can hear the struggle in that word. This wasn't an easy conclusion for him to reach. This was a guy who dedicated his life to defending the faith, and now he's having to confront the possibility that the Book of Mormon might not be what he'd always believed it to be.
Absolutely. And Thomas Alexander, in his 1986 article in Dialogue, he summarizes what he thinks Roberts ultimately concluded. He says Roberts basically thought that Joseph Smith, with his knowledge of American antiquities, with the ideas he might have gotten from View of the Hebrews, and with his own vividly strong creative imagination, well, he could have created the Book of Mormon.
Wow, so he's suggesting that the Book of Mormon wasn't a divinely translated ancient record, but a product of Joseph Smith's own mind, working within the context of his time and the ideas he was exposed to.
Yeah, that's essentially what Roberts seems to have come to believe. And it's a pretty radical departure from the traditional view.
Okay, so he's got this new understanding of the Book of Mormon. What does he do with it?
So he writes a third manuscript, and this one's often called the Parallel. And this one's like a super in-depth comparison between the Book of Mormon and View of the Hebrews. He's meticulously laying out all the thematic and narrative similarities he's found.
So, like Exhibit A, Exhibit B, he's building his case, showing just how much overlap there is.
Exactly. And in October 1927, he sends this manuscript to Apostle Richard Lyman. And what's interesting is that this manuscript, it actually circulated among like a small group of Mormons, kind of under the radar, from 1927 all the way to 1985. So it seems like there was this awareness, this discussion about Robert's ideas happening quietly, even though it wasn't public knowledge.
Yeah, like these were sensitive issues, maybe even a little bit dangerous to talk about openly.
For sure. And we even have a quote from Roberts himself from MormonHamburg.com, where he directly challenges this idea that the Book of Mormon was the first to connect Native Americans to the Hebrews. He says that claim was ignorantly made. So he's clearly aware of other theories out there, and he's not afraid to call out what he sees as, historical inaccuracies, even if they're popular among Mormons.
Yeah, it shows he's really committed to historical accuracy, even if it means going against the grain.
Absolutely.
Right.
And in the letter he sends to Lyman with the parallel, he actually refers to the Book of Mormon as the alleged Nephite record, which is an interesting choice of words, right?
Oh, definitely. He's not just accepting it at face value anymore.
Right. And then he says that the parallels he's presented in the manuscript, those are just a fraction of what he could have shown. He says that the rest is quite as striking. So he's basically saying, look, I've got even more evidence, even more connections between these two books.
So he's not pulling any punches. He's really laying it all out.
Yeah, he's serious. And then he makes this really interesting suggestion to Lyman. He says that it would be a good idea for the church to have a thorough digest of the subject matter, a view of the Hebrews, just in case, someone ever questioned whether Joseph Smith used it. It's almost like he's like giving them a heads up, a warning.
Like, hey, this is out there. You guys better be prepared to deal with it.
Exactly. And thankfully, we have even more insight into Robert's thinking from Wesley P. Lloyd. This guy, he was a missionary who served under Roberts, and later he became a dean at BYU. And just a short time before Roberts died in 1933, they had this long conversation, like 3.5 hours, and Lloyd wrote it all down in his journal.
Wow, so we've got this firsthand account of what Roberts was thinking towards the end of his life.
And it's gold. Lloyd's journal confirms that Roberts was still really bothered by what happened in those 1922 meetings. He was still disappointed that the general authorities basically just bore their testimonies instead of really engaging with his research. And then Lloyd writes down this bombshell. He says Roberts told him that he'd written this huge thesis, like 400 pages, and he called it a revolutionary article on the origin of the Book of Mormon, and he'd sent straight to President Grant.
Holy cow, 400 pages. This wasn't just some casual musings. This was a serious, in-depth analysis.
Oh, yeah. And the fact that Lloyd knew about it, knew how long it was, knew what it was about, it tells you that Roberts, he was serious about these ideas. And then comes the big one. According to Lloyd, Roberts said he swings to a psychological explanation of the Book of Mormon and shows that the plates were not objective, but subjective with Joseph Smith. Basically, he was saying that the Book of Mormon wasn't a translation of real physical plates. It was all in Joseph Smith's head.
Whoa, so he's going full-on psychological explanation. The Book of Mormon as a product of Joseph Smith's mind.
That's what it seems like. And Lloyd, he also writes down this other thing that Roberts said, which is kind of surprising. Roberts said that he thought the Doctrine and Covenants, not the Book of Mormon, was the strongest evidence for Joseph Smith being a prophet.
Interesting. So it sounds like he still believed in Joseph Smith as a prophet, but the Book of Mormon wasn't the foundation of that belief anymore.
Yeah, it seems like his views had really shifted. And Lloyd, he was shocked when he heard all this. Like, he writes about how blown away he was by Roberts' conclusions. That tells you something, right? Even someone who knew Roberts well, who was close to him, even he wasn't expecting this.
Yeah, I mean, this was way outside the mainstream Mormon thinking at the time.
Totally. And after Roberts died in 1933, it seems like the church, they kind of tried to downplay his more critical views. Like, even getting a full biography of him published was a struggle. It was almost like they were trying to control his narrative to keep his doubts under wraps.
Yeah, that happens sometimes, right? Institutions, they often try to protect their image, their history.
But despite that, word of Roberts' doubts, of his conclusions, they kind of circulated among Mormon intellectuals, whispered in secret. So his questions, they didn't just disappear.
Like a hidden current running beneath the surface.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is that you can see echoes of Robert's struggle in some of the ways Mormons today try to reconcile their faith with, the historical and scientific challenges to the Book of Mormon. Like, there's this idea that maybe the Book of Mormon wasn't a literal translation, but more of a, inspired revelation. And then there are all these limited geography theories, which try to explain why there's not a lot of archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon events. And in a way, these ideas, they're grappling with the same kind of questions that Roberts was wrestling with 100 years ago.
It's like his work, his doubts, they planted a seed. And those seeds, they've been growing, even if it's been happening quietly.
And Roberts himself, back in 1922, he actually wrote about this. He said he was worried that it was getting harder and harder to give good answers to the questions people were asking about the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
And he said he was worried about what that would mean for the youth, if they couldn't find satisfying explanations.
He could see the writing on the wall. He knew those questions weren't going away.
Yeah, he was prescient. And when you look at his story, it's full of tension, right? You can see him trying to balance his deep intellectual honesty with his lifelong devotion to the church. He loved Mormonism, he loved the people, but he couldn't ignore the evidence even when it contradicted his beliefs.
Yeah, that's a tough position to be in, trying to hold on to your faith while also being intellectually honest with yourself.
Totally.
Mm.
But I think his story offers some really important lessons for anyone who's searching for truth, whether they're Mormon or not. It shows how crucial intellectual honesty is, how important it is to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it's uncomfortable. It shows the courage it takes to ask tough questions, to challenge your own beliefs. And it reminds us that our understanding of things, even the things we hold most dear, well, it can change. It can evolve as we learn and grow.
Yeah, it's a reminder that, certainty isn't always possible. Sometimes the best we can do is keep searching, keep asking questions, keep being open to new information.
Absolutely. So that's B.H. Roberts, a complex figure, a brilliant scholar, a devout believer who ultimately ended up questioning the very foundations of his faith. And his journey, his struggles, they're still relevant today. They still speak to us. They still challenge us.
Yeah, and they raise these huge questions, right? Like, how do we balance our faith with our intellect? What do we do when the evidence contradicts our beliefs? How do we approach those contradictions with honesty and integrity?
Exactly. And those are the questions I hope our listeners will take away from this deep dive. B.H. Roberts' story, it's a powerful reminder that these questions are important, that they're worth wrestling with, even if the answers aren't always easy or clear-cut.
Absolutely. I think it's a story that stays with you, that makes you think.
It definitely does. All right, well, that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithay.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.